Have you ever been told you should have known, even though no one actually said it out loud? If you've been burned by systems that rely on unwritten rules and ambiguous expectations, and then quietly imply you're the problem, you're not alone. In this episode that kicks off the new season of Think Differently, we'll start naming that pattern and exploring how moving past debate and blame is the only way to prevent the problem in the first place. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new season of Think Differently. To start season 4 and really to kick off the year, I want to talk about something I've been noticing for a long time and feel is especially relevant right now. And that's when something goes wrong, whether it's at school, our relationships, at work, or in our communities. When real harm occurs, we must immediately move into defense and explanations. People imply we should have known. And I want to name early that this is something neurodivergent people experience constantly, not because it only affects us, but because we tend to encounter issues first. We often feel the breakdown before others do, which makes this less an identity issue and more of an early warning signal. And instead of sitting with what happened and the impact, many people rush to explain or justify the why. We debate intent. We debate whether intent supersedes impact. We start what-ifing the situation. We look for the edge cases, exceptions, and alternate interpretations. And all of this sounds thoughtful. It might be logical, maybe even reasonable, like we're trying to understand the root cause so we can say we want to prevent things from happening again. And maybe even figure out accountability. Dare say, who to blame. And on the surface, all that talk feels like we're taking the issue seriously. But a lot of the time, what's really happening is deflection. Because instead of saying, this person was hurt, they're bleeding, and we need to treat the wound, we started saying things like, well, they wouldn't have gotten hurt if they hadn't been standing in the way, or had they read the situation differently or understood how things usually work, this wouldn't have occurred. And that's the moment when we quietly turn the problem, the incident, into a debate. And when we do that, something really important gets lost. And this is the part I don't think we talk about enough. At some point, explanation stops being a path to understanding, and it actually starts functioning as avoidance. It lets us sound thoughtful when we're actually not changing anything. It lets us analyze harm instead of taking responsibility for preventing it from happening again. And here's the thing that's really bothering me. These are not hypothetical problems. These are not philosophical exercises. They already happened. Someone was harmed. Someone lost an opportunity. Something in the system failed. A process didn't work. A rule, a norm, a safeguard, whatever you want to call it, formal or informal, something broke down. So the most important question is not who can explain it best, or rationalize it away most cleanly, or outline all the reasons why this situation was complicated or exceptional or technically justified. The question that really matters here is so much simpler and much, much harder, because it's really the only question that matters. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Because the blame game doesn't solve anything. Explanation, when it becomes the endpoint, doesn't solve anything either. It pulls us away from the fact that the outcome already occurred, and whatever rules or shared understanding were supposed to be in place did not hold up in that moment. So the question isn't, did something happen? Because we know it did. The question is, what are we missing, and what would need to change to prevent this from happening again? And I see this over and over. And if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you've probably heard this thread before. That instead of looking at the system or the context in which people are operating, we almost immediately narrow it down to the individual. We talk about the character, their judgment, their awareness, their ability to read the room, their failure to navigate the situation correctly. We ask why that person didn't understand what was happening, why they didn't interpret the context the right way, why they didn't follow the rules that may or may not have been clear or consistently enforced or even in place in that very moment. And embedded in all of that is an assumption we almost never interrogate, whether the system itself is working as intended. Are the rules clear? Were the expectations stable? Are people actually operating according to how things are supposed to be? And if those assumptions aren't true, and often they're not, then blaming individuals doesn't prevent future harm. It just protects the system from scrutiny. This is exactly why neurodivergent people are often blamed first, not because they caused the failure, but because they don't automatically compensate for the ambiguity the way others have learned to do. When systems rely on guesswork, the people who take language seriously are the ones who get burned first. Let me slow this down with a really ordinary example because I think this will help you see it more clearly. Think about being at work. It's the end of the day, nothing dramatic has happened, and someone comes over and says, "Hey, me and the guys are going out for drinks tonight." They tell you where they're going. Maybe they even say the time. And you say, "Oh, okay, have a good time." And you don't go. Now, for some people listening, that scenario was an obvious invitation. For others listening, especially my neurodivergent community, that would have been taken as someone sharing information about their evening, maybe even explaining why they're leaving work at that very moment. And the problem is that both interpretations exist in the same system. Sometimes, when we say we're going out for drinks, it means you're invited. Other times, it just means we're telling you what we're doing and why we're leaving. And the rule for how you're supposed to tell the difference is almost never stated out loud. So when you don't show up and later hear, "Oh, we thought you didn't want to come, you never show up to these things," the responsibility quietly shifts to the individual who was never explicitly invited. Like, you should have known. But known what exactly? That's not an individual social failure. That's an overall system communication failure. And when our systems require people to correctly interpret unstated rules in order to belong, exclusion isn't accidental, it's baked in. So how might this look differently? In addition to being explicit and saying, "Hey, Bob, we're going out to drinks tonight at 7:30. Would you like to join us?" That would be a great start. Even further, for many neurodivergent women out there, would be to clarify, "Come as you are. We're all going straight from work," or say, "Many of us are going home first to change into jeans." Because another thing many neurodivergent people get wrong and stressed about is knowing the customary expectations of dress and wanting to fit in, but never feeling comfortable in asking the question. What if we just spelled out things clearly so we could all be on the same page and not assume people can read our minds? And this same pattern shows up in much higher stakes situations too. One of the clearest examples of this came from my dissertation research. There was a neurodivergent employee working with a hostile internal client. They were aggressive, sending harsh-worded emails, condescending tone, creating constant friction. And the employee went to their manager, and the manager wanted to help them out. I believe that. So the manager said to the employee, "Don't let him bother you, just ignore him." And the autistic employee took that instruction literally. The employee stopped responding to the person's emails, stopped returning their phone calls, disengaged from those communications completely. A few weeks later, the internal client is now furious and escalates straight to the manager and says, "What the hell's going on? Your employee won't even respond to me anymore." And the manager had this moment, not because it was funny, though I do see the humor in it, but because the employee had done exactly what they were told to do. And thank God this was a good manager, and they actually took ownership for the misunderstanding. Because the implicit meaning was don't let him get under your skin and keep doing your job. But the explicit instruction was ignore him. And that is exactly what the employee did. The system of how we operate socially in this society relied on a shared interpretation instead of clarity. And when that interpretation failed, the easiest response would have been, well, you should have known what I meant. Thank God in this case, the manager didn't do that. They understood the error and realized how important clarity of communication and direction really means. But more often, people would lean on the, you should have known what I meant. But that response doesn't fix anything. That really wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a social norm that confused implication and metaphor with instruction. And that could have punished the person who actually took the direction seriously. But so often we put no ownership on the people who design how we communicate and operate in our social systems. And we punish the person who followed the rule as given or based on their best ability to interpret it. This is the circle I keep seeing. Something goes wrong. We debate explanations. We assign blame. We dissect intent, right? I didn't mean for her to ignore you, is what could have been said. But if that's the case and the manager just kept doing the things the way they always did, then nothing would really change. So most of the time, we end up in debates on whether something should or should not have happened. They feel intellectual, maybe even moral, but most of the time, they're just a hamster wheel. Because prevention requires something different. It requires intention and change in action. Redesign asks questions we don't like asking. What conditions made this outcome likely? What signals were missed or ignored or confusing? Where were the guardrails weak or unclear or absent? And maybe most importantly, what assumptions were baked in that collapsed under pressure? These questions don't give us a neat villain or a person to blame. And they don't give us clean narratives. And they don't let us point to one person and say, that's the problem because everything else always works fine. But these are the only questions that will reduce recurrence. And when we don't ask them, here's what happens instead. People stop asking questions. They stop surface problems early. They start optimizing for survival instead of contribution. And by the time something truly breaks, we all act like it's a big surprise. And this is where the neurodivergent experience matters. Again, not as an identity issue, but as information. Neurodivergent people often experience system breakdowns first, not because we're less capable or less skilled, but because we're more sensitive to unclear rules, shifting expectations, inconsistency between what people say and what they actually do, and environments that rely heavily on implication instead of clarity. When systems rely on implicit social norms instead of explicit rules and directions, the burden falls on the individual to guess correctly. And when someone guesses wrong, we call it a personal failure instead of what it really is, a design flaw. There are a lot of people walking around pretending they understand expectations they don't. And because no one wants to be the person who asks the question and shows that they don't understand and maybe don't belong. That's not inclusion. That's not even assimilation. That's avoidance. And neuro-occlusion at its core isn't about making exceptions or softening expectations. It's about increasing clarity. It's about being intentional about our expectations and how they're stated and how we work together, and not shifting the rules or hoping that people understand what's being implied. Where success doesn't depend on your ability to guess correctly. When we actually design for how people actually live and think and work and communicate, we don't weaken systems, we strengthen them. So if you're listening to this and thinking of a moment where you were told you should have known, you're not alone. And the point isn't that everything can always be perfectly clear or that no one should ever make mistakes. The point is that we shouldn't be relying on systems based on ambiguity and then call it competence when somebody survives it and a failure when somebody doesn't. So this season is about looking at these moments honestly, not to assign blame and not just to explain why things happen, but to ask better questions about how we can move forward better. Because how we design our workplaces, our schools, our communities, where people are expected to operate collectively together and, more importantly, succeed, this is something we can actually do. But we need to be clear in our intentions and consistent in our rules, because clarity isn't about lowering the bar. It's about making the bar reachable without all the guesswork. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank AudioWorks Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.